Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention, maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. G'day everybody, welcome to another episode of Voice of Gord. Been a few days since I last dropped one. This should be dropping on Tuesday, September 26th, 2023. Last show would have come out on the 15th when I finished up a run of 6 episodes across National Truck Driver Appreciation Week. I hope my truck drivers appreciated the show. Not 100% sure that it was returned in high numbers, but if you want to go listen to them, check them out. The last 6 episodes were pretty cool. Started off with Dr. Michael Belzer, wound it up on Friday with the guys from Overdrive Magazine, and lots of good stuff in between. Other announcements, I'm back on Twitter. Yeah, you can come find me at voice_of_Gord. It'll be the official Voice of Gord podcast and Autonomous Truckers Substack Twitter account. As my friend Justin said, it's the return of the king. King of Bullshit Mountain, maybe, but a king nonetheless, I guess. All right. Well, on this episode here, this is a real good one. This was so good, I had to bring on a co-pilot, my buddy Brandon Daly. You guys will remember Brandon from a roundtable we did on vehicle maintenance and society. Brandon's a good dude, and he asked some great questions of our guest, philosopher, writer. All of you guys should go read his books. Matthew B Crawford, author of Shop Class as Soulcraft, The World Beyond Your Head, and Why We Drive, my favorite work of modern philosophy. I was real happy to get Matthew on. Was kind of surprised he said yes. So it tickled the cockles of my fanboy heart. Matthew's also been writing extensively over on Substack at his new project Archedelia, which you should also check out. I'm going to provide links to all that stuff down in the show notes. Had a couple of shout outs to some folks on the show, Michael Thomas of Sharon and Big Dog Sib. Go follow those guys on Twitter. They're great. And yeah, we had a pretty wide-ranging chat about Matthew's work, his approach to, making that connection between, the life of the mind and the work of the hands, and how we're losing both of those things in this weird techno-dystopian future, which is now our present. It was a really, really good conversation, and I'm not going to hold you up any longer. So let's get right to it. Matthew B. Crawford, Why We Drive on Voice of Gord. All right, g'day everybody, and welcome to another episode of Voice of Gord. I'm Gord, this is my voice. Today we have a very special guest and another special guest, so you're going to hear 2 other voices. First off, I've asked a co-pilot to assist me with this interview and discussion, because our guest is just like too much for me to handle all by myself. So please welcome back to the show, Master of Art and Religion and Red Seal diesel mechanic, Mr. Brandon Daly.
Howdy.
And the other voice you're going to hear today is that of, if you're an NPR nerd or a dissident of sorts, 2 opposing things, but that's where this gentleman has been most well known. Author of Shop Class as Soulcraft, The World Beyond Your Head, and my new favorite work of philosophy, Why We Drive, Towards a Philosophy of the Open Road, and the Archedelia Substack, Mr. Matthew B. Crawford. Welcome to Voice of Gord, sir.
Hey, thanks, Gord. I'm really stoked to be here.
Yeah, how this all happened, I don't know, but I owe God some beers. So my audience ostensibly is somewhat truckers, I'd like it to be more of them, but I think I've picked up a few other weirdos and nerds along the way. But if you've never heard of Matthew Crawford and you drive for a living or otherwise work for a living or do anything with your hands, he's your guy. You should go read Why We Drive right now, as soon as this show is over. Mr. Crawford, how is it you got into all of this writing? And tell us about your mechanical background, and just tell a little brief intro if you don't mind.
All right. Well, I guess I'll go kind of chronologically as far as mechanical stuff. I don't know how far to go back, but I had a strange upbringing. I was lived in this commune type of thing, and when I was just about to turn 14, they needed somebody small enough that they could stuff them up into this crawl space to run some conduit. So I got recruited by the electrical crew, and I ended up doing electrical work off and on all through high school and college. So, and then went into business actually doing that illegally for a while. When I was 15, I worked briefly at a Porsche shop, it was an independent Porsche garage. Majored in physics, then got interested in philosophy and did some of that. Took a job at a think tank. I hated it, and I quit that to open a motorcycle repair shop.
What think tank was it?
It was called the Marshall Institute.
And what was the purpose of the Marshall Institute, or their
They were
sort of
into
objective?
they were into climate change stuff and missile defense. And
The hell of a combination.
yeah, it was started by this physicist. Anyway, I don't especially recommend it. So yeah, anyway, then I was repairing motorcycles for a while, and then that shaded into fabricating parts for custom bikes. You know, started off just making the occasional bracketry and whatnot. But then I got into something called metal shaping, which is like English wheel and stuff like that. So putting compound curves in sheet metal, and was doing that for a while. You know that show, The Walking Dead?
Yeah,
So
I've only ever seen like one or two chunks of episodes. I don't watch much TV, but that's the
yeah,
one. That's the one with the guy with the baseball bat and the barbed wire.
it's the zombie apocalypse thing. I've only seen like one or two episodes myself, but anyway, the reason I mentioned it, I'm bragging, is that a couple of parts I made ended up on the motorcycle in that show. So,
Oh, cool.
yeah, that's the only reason I mentioned it.
Well, I'm glad you weren't like one of the guys that got like your head caved in, because the one episode I watched was pretty brutal and turned me off ever watching it again. So
Yeah. So not my cup of tea either. But as far as the writing, so I had some friends who started this journal back around, I don't know, 2003 or so. It's called The New Atlantis. And I wrote a couple of things for them. It's just this, little rag, hardly any circulation, I think. But one of the things I wrote was this article called Shop Class of Soulcraft. And so that was an attempt to basically make sense of my own work experience, which didn't seem to fit the official stories we were telling about work. In particular, having had both white collar jobs and jobs in the trades, I realized that I had found myself more intellectually challenged doing some of those trade jobs than so-called knowledge work. And so I thought would be a good idea to try to figure out why that was the case. And doing that sort of launched me into this whole historical inquiry about the origins of the assembly line and the separation of thinking from doing, which is this basic kind of dynamic in capitalism for the last 100 years. So yeah, it became this wide-ranging sort of inquiry into work, and it was a big hit. So that then became a book.
it's interesting how you just said the separation of the thinking from the doing, because your most recent project, Archedelia, you've written a series of essays which sort of are kind of adjacent or butt up to some other, dissident thinking going around the internet. And it strikes me that one of the reasons we sort of have this regime and these technocrats and experts, and this sort of follows on from James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, is that divide between the thinking and the doing is now so wide. It's like it's a gulf between these two different groups of people. And there's only a few stragglers left in between, such as yourself. They kind of also follow the sort of dominant political tribes here in the United States as well, and probably other parts of the West. So it's just sort of interesting that, like, you got your start in writing with that thought process, and we are now sort of seeing it play out in politics today.
Yeah. So just to, in case your listeners aren't familiar with that basic idea. So Henry Ford invents the assembly line, right? So at the time, the people building cars were like recruited from bicycle shops and carriage shops. So these were kind of all around craftsmen who, were able to build stuff. And the great innovation of the assembly line was that you could hire people who didn't know how to do anything, basically, because it's just a repetitive, some tiny part of the process. So essentially, you can think of it as gathering all of that craft knowledge that was scattered in the heads of those tradespeople and installing it in a process, which once you've installed it, you no longer need skilled professionals. And one of the interesting facts is that when the assembly line first got going, Ford would have to hire 900 people to retain 100, because this way of working was so repellent to people to just basically be a cog in a machine. And this basic idea of taking the cognitive elements of the job and sort of removing them to a separate management class, and then sort of dumbing down the actual doing of it so you can hire unskilled labor. You see that all over the economy. And it's not just, manufacturing. It's a lot of white collar work is subject to the same thing.
Right. Yeah. And that's accelerating under the introduction of large language model technologies like ChatGPT. Yeah. I've seen that in my own work in trucking. They really started pushing automatic transmissions in big trucks about 20 years ago, and now they're basically ubiquitous. They're so ubiquitous that when you go get a CDL, many states will have a distinction between, did you learn how to drive on an automatic or a manual, because one license does not allow you to operate the other. And that has been done. They like to lie about it. They like to say, well, we can't find drivers. The driver shortage narrative is a lie. It always has been. It's, again, this process of de-skilling, dumbing people down, making it easier to get them, because other parts of the industry and the problems within it just weren't going to be addressed, and haven't been, and still aren't in many ways. So we see that a lot in the trucking business. I'd like to bring Mr. Brandon in here. What have you got anything to add, sir?
Well, I was just gonna say, I think in The World Beyond Your Head, Matt, don't you? There's like, it's not your saying, but you throw in this old time saying that's like, cheap men need expensive jigs, and expensive men need just the tools in their toolbox. Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's the difference in the kind of person you just mentioned. And the example I think you gave at the beginning of that book was your short order cook versus maybe like a McDonald's or something.
Right.
The short order cook who's able to kind of set himself up with jigs of his own making in order to get this job done, versus all these externals that like are just a process, like you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think the distinction is external versus internal, because the short order cook will arrange things sort of spatially in the kitchen to sort of set it up to minimize the need to sort of monitor things, like,
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I just meant jig as in like coming from the agency of the person, versus like kind of top down.
Sort of remote control. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
But and we see that through all, like you said, we see it through all areas now. I mean, there's a push for, I guess, cheaper labor at the expense of skill and expertise. I know when I worked at a Freightliner dealership, they preach to you about like truck coming in, check engine lights, print out all the codes, and then print out all the troubleshooting. But there's a lot of troubleshooting that I'd get to the end of, and I wouldn't have the answers I needed because it wasn't comprehensive. And the troubleshooting is very detached from the realities often that are on the ground. For instance, if you've never run your own shop or you don't know what the price of these parts are, that often goes into how you troubleshoot something on your own if those things are kept in front of you, but they're not kept in front of you at a dealership for a tech generally. So it might be out of order to troubleshoot something a certain way, but if that order means the difference between 2 and 12 hours, then that's a big difference. Like, it feels like they just wanted to hand troubleshooting steps to like a monkey, basically.
Yeah.
And, but there's no joy in that. Like, if you don't know the system you're working on, it's much more fun to
and
know
those
what
systems,
you do.
they never, like you said, it's far from complete. And they sort of present an image of like rigor when you have some flow chart and, you've got a set of trouble codes and, you work your way through it. But
I once had a troubleshooting tell me to ohm out one wire in a harness that had 6 wires in it. And it got to the end and it's like, oh, you should be good. I was like, wait a second. There's 6 other wires in this harness. Why did it not have me check, continuity across this whole harness? It was really strange. And of course it was in a different wire.
Yeah. If you like any manual that was truly comprehensive would be simply like the car itself. It's like a map that's so detailed that it's just the world. I think the effort to dumb things down and sort of make it idiot proof always introduces all these unintended kind of perversities that tend to make your job harder. That's what I found.
You, in one of your recent Archedelia pieces, Seeing Like Google, and it's about the black cabbies in London and the idea of tacit knowledge, taught knowledge, having spent the time to put all of this information and skill into your mind, and how technology is starting to affect that. And like you guys were just saying here, in the course of dumbing it down, there also something's being lost. It's not quite the same to just follow a Google map around London as it is to like know the place, right? Could you speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, so these London cabbies, they go through this incredible training process that takes, like 5 years of 5 years of basically walking the entire city over and over to learn it, intimately, and or doing it on a scooter with a map taped to the windscreen, and the they have these examinations regularly that are conducted in like formal attire with the master cabbies. It's a guild, really, and the so it's called the knowledge. Is what they call it. And the final exam has been likened to passing the bar or getting a medical license. It's one of the most demanding cognitive tests that there is. So they might be asked, the location of 4 different Gordon Ramsay restaurants, or the location of some tiny little statue that's up, in a doorway in some particular intersection. They're expected to know all this, and so they serve not just as cab drivers, but as sort of tour guides and as guides to the city. So this is a very proud tradition. They actually have I don't know what you call it, a royal charter from the Queen. So the problem was when Uber started muscling into the city, hiring, drivers who usually recent immigrants who don't know the city much better than you or I would, and paid, basically a subsistence wage. But they have the GPS to guide them around. So, this is good for consumers, I suppose, because it's cheaper. But you're talking about the loss of a way of life, a really hard earned knowledge, and a kind of fraternity or guild. And this was sort of fed right into the Brexit sort of political energy, the sense of getting colonized by a foreign power, essentially. Because these ride-hailing firms, they were American, at least initially, and they're using GPS satellites that are actually owned by the U.S. military. So it was kind of like, a sense of colonization. And so the Brexit motto was "Take back control." And I think what was happening to the cabbies kind of encapsulated this broader feeling of being subject to, transfer of political sovereignty from local control and democratic processes to these sort of supranational entities that cannot, be held to account at all by sort of democratic process.
One of the difficulties I have in speaking with people about this, sort of in my own circles, my in-laws, various friends, certain members of my family, is they they develop, I hate to sound insulting, but I've been dealing with this for so long now that I'm going to use these terms, and I mean it. And if you hear this and you think I'm being insulting, well, too bad. Um, these sort of programmed Pavlovian responses, where they hear something like Brexit and they just immediately think, well, it's just all these racist old English guys sitting around at the pub complaining about, the immigrants or something. And they don't see the sort of deeper stuff that's going on, like, as you have articulated in this article about, Google and how the sort of mapping of the terrain of the world is sort of this imperial project used to in history by nation states to understand the people they're controlling. And now we don't live really in a world of nation states anymore. I mean, on paper we do, but we've got these sort of huge corporations. And I got in a bit of an argument with a guy yesterday, because he seems to think that Facebook is still a private company, despite it being up to its eyeballs with spooks, the Atlantic Council having been forced on them after the congressional hearings in 2016 after Trump won. And I don't know how much you come across this in the academy, but like I'm getting really tired of like listening to everybody's thought terminating cliches and their politics being stuck in the like 80s or 90s or something. And they're just they don't sort of see the problem. And then when it comes from the bottom, when it comes from people like the black cabbies or people like my friend Edward Escobar out in California, who's fighting these robo taxis running around San Francisco, and they just don't, like, they can't make the connection. And one of the reasons I really like your writing is because you do. And I think more people sort of need to hear it. And I don't know, maybe you could sort of like expound on your recent series on the party state and like your sort of examination of what exactly is going on here. Because I really think people need to see this and get it in their heads.
Yeah. Well, yeah. This Substack, like I'm calling it Archedelia. That's a word I coined from the Greek that would mean rule revealing. So by analogy with psychedelia, which would mean mind revealing. So I'm trying to get a handle on, the fact that, we continue to call it a liberal democracy, but I don't think it's either of those. things. So it's been a transfer of sovereignty to a kind of a set of clerisys, I want to say, kind of priest-like bodies. And some of this is sort of technical, sort of technocratic, determination to bring everything under rational control. And the other is more kind of moral clerics who, declare large swaths of sort of ordinary opinion toxic and, phobic of one sort or another. And so basically common sense is disqualified as a guide to reality. And the sort of common intuitions that people have, people start to kind of doubt their own sense of reality. And this kind of greases the way, I think, for, representative bodies becoming moribund, the real actions taking place elsewhere. So obviously in America, a lot of things are decided through the courts, but then you also have this vast administrative state that decides so much. And, in the Constitution, it's supposed to be Congress that makes laws. But a lot of, the sort of things that determine the character of everyday life are not actually on the book as laws. They're administrative rulings. Or, you mentioned Facebook, it's just decisions by the sort of platform firms, which sort of govern so much of daily life in ways that aren't in any way kind of accounted for in standard, political theory.
You can zoom this administrative rulemaking and its sort of lack of accountability to everyday life. Again, this is a podcast about trucking. I'm a trucker and try and keep it there somehow. But so there's this woman and she's the head of this regulatory body called the FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And a few years ago, the electronic logging device mandate came in. And so all these truckers are now, tracked by law by the state. So your sort of privacy's out the window. They know where you are. They know how long you've worked. They're on you. And it's been around since December 2017. And studies have been done. The statistics are in. Truck involved crashes are not down. They are up. Aggressive driving is not down. It is up. All of the problems it was said to solve have not been solved. In fact, they've been made worse. The receipts are in. Everybody acknowledges it. What does Robin Hutchison have to say? Well, we're not changing this. We're not revisiting it. So, these administrators, these technocrats, there's especially under the COVID regime, we were told, you got to trust the science. You got to trust the statistics. We have all these experts. Well, when your own studies show X and you still want to push Y, can we even believe you when you employ these thought-terminating cliches about expertise and following the science wherever it goes? Clearly, when you get down to the minutia of a tiny part of the economy like where I work in, and as it applies to my work life, they clearly don't give a shit.
Yeah, I think the the pandemic opened a lot of people's eyes to some fundamental contradictions in the way authority operates. Science, properly understood, is a mode of inquiry, right? And it's one that distinguishes itself by insisting that any claim it makes should be falsifiable, right? It sort of lays itself open to being contested in that way. And that's what distinguishes it from, say, religion. But the role that science with a capital S is pressed into by the sort of party state, as I call it, is that it is to serve precisely as an authority, just diametrically opposed to its nature as a kind of ongoing search for truth. So when science is pressed into duty as authority, that is necessarily politicized then, and we just saw just how corrupt the whole process, the whole sort of apparatus is of these scientific cartels, basically, that are getting funding from NIH, and then there's the pharmaceutical companies, and I think people are pretty cynical at this point about the whole thing.
Matt, do you think this is inherent from the beginning, like from the beginning of accepting this kind of liberal democracy? Do you think it stems right from that, or do we go off the rails at some point? I'm thinking kind of along the lines of like, who I'm not super well read in, but Ivan Illich, Tools of Conviviality, or maybe a little bit of a Lou in there and stuff. I think a lot of those writers would say that this is just a natural progression. So I guess that's my question. Was it going to come off the rails from the beginning, or did it come off the rails at some other moment?
Yeah, that is. I'm glad you mentioned Illich. It's like the further back you look, the more you can see these troubles brewing. Way back, and even if you go way back, the change in science back, I guess, like the 16th century, 17th century, from a kind of passive contemplation of nature, systematic but not, based on intervening, to this more technological mindset where you have to, I think Bacon said, torture nature to give up her secrets. And it's inherently connected to power. There's this great Canadian, a guy named George Grant, who wrote about technology. He was a philosopher, and he points out that the distinctive, so techne is simply skill. And so there's always been techne. What's distinctive is kind of revealed in the word technology itself. So you're joining logos to techne. The point is that it's a kind of manipulation as a mode of knowing. And the idea is that unless you can manipulate it, it's not knowable. So it kind of puts the human activity of sort of changing the world at the very core of what it means to know the world. That seems to be the new thing that leads maybe inevitably to this condition where the world as given is experienced as something paltry or dirty or bad and needs to be overcome and transformed. And so it's, within the history of Christianity, there's the Gnostic heresy, which consists of just that creation is not something good. It's sort of made by God's evil twin or something like that. And so man's task is to create heaven on earth. So that seems to be pretty close to the technological mindset. I say all that as a technologist myself, right? I mean, making machines and stuff.
Where do you think so speaking of, technology, and now in the hands of this, unaccountable administrative state that's, sort of functions as an arm, you call it the party state. People in dissident circles might just refer to it as the regime. There's a really good song by this Canadian band. You mentioned this fellow Grant, Canadian. There's a band called Rush. Many people will be familiar with. And they have this song called Red Barchetta, which is, I think I'm even pronouncing that improperly. Red Barchetta. I don't know. Anyway, the crux of the song and the lyrics is that, in this future, cars have been completely banned. And there's this, the sort of protagonist of the song who's got this, crazy uncle guy that lives in the country and keeps this little Italian sports car hiding in his barn, and he has to like get out of the city and go out there, and then he like takes it for a drive and gets pursued by like police and air cars and stuff like that. And we're now seeing the unleashing of autonomous vehicles onto the roads here in the United States in various capacities. And we also have this other capital S, which is a through line through why we drive, which is safetyism.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have this administrative state making, platitudes towards safety, and the tech companies are going to come in and say, well, here we have this technology that's going to fundamentally alter the sort of understanding of freedom of mobility in the United States and probably in other places. And I just wonder, like, how fast that's going to happen, if and when it happens. And you mentioned the sort of road as like a place of mutual trust. And if they mandate these vehicles using the pretext of safety, I don't know how they're going to manage to like mix people and robotic autonomous vehicles, because that trust isn't going to be there. But then you also have like the fact that, as we can see, under the COVID regime, the Freedom Convoy, Brexit, like nobody's listening to us, like the little people. So I guess to get to my point here, like, what do you like? What's your thoughts on how this is going to play out? The unleashing of autonomous vehicles on the road in the United States. Like, do you have an idea of how that's going to go down, and how it's going to turn out politically?
Well, I think the first thing you got to sort of get in front of you is the fact that none of this is a response to consumer demand. So when like Pew and other polling firms poll people, their attitudes about driverless cars, most people are not interested. So it's a kind of a top-down project of social engineering for profit, I think. So I actually rode in a driverless taxi for the first time just a couple of weeks ago in San Francisco.
How was that?
It was weird. I was crammed in this seat with two other people, and they were being super goofy, so I was having a hard time even paying attention to what was going on. One of them was Freddie Sayers, believe it or not, the unheard guy.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Anyway, so they're being deployed in San Francisco. There's quite a bit of opposition to it. But there's now, I think, like 400 of these cars on the road in San Francisco. I think they're only allowed to operate at night. But so, for example, the decision to allow this was at a meeting of the Public Utilities Commission just about a month ago. Turns out one of the four members of that commission is the former like top lawyer for Cruise. So, which kind of helps you see that, it's kind of rigged from the outset in terms of, whether people want them or not. We're going to get it good and hard. And you have people going around San Francisco putting cones on the hoods of these things, which then paralyzes them. So there's a kind of guerrilla response like that. So let me tell you one story. This is way back in 2009, when Google was first getting into driverless cars. And one of his cars came to a four-way stop and was waiting for the other cars to stop before going through, because that's the rule it was taught. But of course, that's not what people actually do. So the car got paralyzed and blocked the intersection. So the Google guy in charge of the project said that what he was learning from it is that human beings need to be less idiotic, by which he meant they need to behave more like computers. So completely invisible to him was the fact that at a typical intersection, what's going on when people make eye contact. Maybe one waves the other through if there's an ambiguous case of right of way. People work things out and manage to cooperate well enough for the most part. And so the fact that that social intelligence on display at that intersection was just invisible to the Google guy, I think that's pretty significant. Because to make things hospitable to their cars, they have to sort of get humans out of the way or get us to behave more like computers. That is more kind of adapted to the system's need for clean inputs and sort of predictable behavior.
Yeah, there's another book that came out recently, and I referenced it in this piece I did for Compact. Um, a professor, sociologist here at Cornell by the name of Karen Levy, and she dedicates a chapter of this book, Data Driven Truckers, Technology, and the New Workplace Surveillance. I don't know if you guys have read it or not, but I've read it like 3 times. I wrote a review of it. I've interviewed Karen. One of the chapters in her book is called The Slope. And in it, she's exploring, like, what do we do with people as this technology continues to advance and they sort of keep, pushing it out there. And, she called it the slope. It sort of runs parallel to my thinking on this of like, they don't have the robots quite yet, but they want to roboticize us, right? And you see this with the imposition of this surveillance technology, the lane control, the front crash avoidance. So, like, they still need the people, but they want to like part out so much of what we do to this tech. So they're sort of like kind of making us into cyborgs, even though we didn't ask for it.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, this is a top-down thing. Nobody's asking for this, and you're seeing this now in the market. There's this website called Bring a Trailer that
Yeah.
basically sells used vehicles, and cars that once sold for like $9,000 in the 1980s are selling for 30, 40, 50 because you can work on them and it has a manual transmission and you can drive it yourself, right? So as you said, the market clearly, a lot of people, at least in our sort of age bracket, are not interested in this, but the party state and its technocratic administrators don't seem to care. And the people who want to make money from, roboticizing the roads stand to make a lot of money doing this, and they seem to have more of the ear of the government. And so, like, in another one of your pieces, you referenced James C. Scott, who wrote several books, Seeing Like a State, The Art of Not Being Governed. Scott chronicles various forms of resistance of various groups of people, mostly in Asia and other parts of the world, to, the imposition of like state-like organizations on their lives. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on what the resistance to the technocratic imperium and all of its robots is going to look like. I have some ideas, but I'd like to hear yours and Brandon's.
I can't wait to hear yours. I mean, because he could. I just know it.
You first.
Well, you can't help but have a kind of road warrior, Mad Max fantasies of, like busting out the nitrous and, putting the blower on an old Holden and sort of feral horsepower freaks who are living underground. And okay, so one bright spot I think is the technical forums on the internet where people are pushing like the state of the art of the internal combustion engine to places that weren't expected even 30 years ago, and sharing knowledge and you do get a kind of, vibe of it being a genuine counterculture, the whole hot rodding scene. I think we're actually living in the golden age of hot rodding. Maybe there was another one, before the 80s when things were, more intelligible, before computerization. And as you point out, those older cars fetch a premium, I think, not just because of nostalgia, but also for the reasons you said, that they kind of invite full ownership in that sense, tinkering. But also the whole, tuner scene, I was initially kind of dismissive of it or something, simply because, I'm not into computers, but people are getting crazy horsepower these days. But, so it's all about boost. And if you have electronic engine management, you can run 20, 30 pounds of boost and not detonate the motor because you've got,
and direct injection, right? That's helped a lot.
Sure, yeah. But even short of that, like there are air-cooled VW motors running over 20 pounds of boost and making 400 horsepower on the street. So it's all about ignition timing and air fuel mixture. So in a way, these forums where people are just pushing it and building on this collective knowledge, I find that pretty inspiring. So I have the chapter in Why We Drive called Folk Engineering, where I talk about that stuff.
Right. So you see the resistance as people continuing to tinker with older and modern vehicles, and then just kind of doing their own thing. I just wonder though, like, so we have this venal and vindictive administrative state we live under, and they're now using climate alarmism to force everybody to buy electric vehicles, and without any thought about how the grid's going to support it. But that's I actually did another podcast with somebody else about that, but I wonder, do you think they would go that far in a place like America that's still heavily populated with tinkerers and rednecks and gas monkeys, to try and take that from people? Like, I'm just wondering, like, how dystopian it might get.
Yeah, well, COVID seemed like kind of a little experiment to see just how compliant we are. And I think there was big regional differences, kind of blue state, red state, I think, and probably urban versus rural as well. I don't know, what's your take on it?
I live in upstate New York. I'm from Canada. Everyone witnessed what the Canadian state did to what was probably the largest peaceful protest in Canadian history. My friends at the Good Old Boys podcast are fond of the saying, power petitioning itself. That's like recognized protests for the like identity politics stuff. BLM can do whatever they want. Climate activists can do whatever they
I
want.
like that. Power petitioning itself.
Yeah. And if you're not sanctioned, if you're just a bunch of truckers that show up in Ottawa saying, I would like to carry on working and have my bodily autonomy, you get crushed under the full weight of the state. There's still people in prison for that in Canada right now, even though they did nothing wrong. That's another story. But like, having witnessed this, and given the I hate to sound like such a black pillar, but given the die off of more of the sort of like boomer types that had the muscle cars, that had the motorcycles, that much like yourself grew up working on things, the more of those people go, and the more we're left with, I don't think I think this article might have got linked in my compact piece about the fact, like, so many kids don't even get their driver's license anymore. They're not taking that sort of, honored, rite of passage in America to like drive yourself around. And, I hate to sound like old man yelling at cloud, but there's legitimate concern about some of the younger kids that like can't seem to communicate. They're locked into screens. Critical thinking and skepticism where regards the government seem to be in short supply. And under all of these conditions and the sort of continued advance of this administrative state. Like, I wouldn't put it past them. Like, if they just start pulling the plug on oil refineries, I mean, we can tune and keep alive all these old cars a la Cuba as long as we want. But when they just say that's it, no more fuel, then what? Now does it become like, instead of, prohibition era whiskey makers with their backyard stills, does like everybody buy their own oil upgrader or something? Like, I wonder, like, it sounds somewhat ridiculous, but like, we've witnessed the craziest shit in the last few years. So like, I can't put it past them. I guess that's my take. Brandon?
Yeah, I mean, we're not there yet, at least, totally. And I think one thing we can try to do between now and then or never is just carve out little pockets of resistance to be kind of, to steal from like Brave New World, to kind of be like the savage, right? Who like claims the right to be unhappy, supposedly, because he doesn't want to live in this completely artificial, though supposedly safe, like, environment. And so back to your earlier question, like, some things, and like a lot of people are doing, is the old car thing. When we talk about ownership, and owning an old car is different than owning a new car in a lot of ways. And owning an old car, my dad and I have a saying. We say, unless the high beam switch is on the floor, we don't want it. So there's like, a small block Chevy transmission, it's all easy stuff that's relatively inexpensive too to fix. And you actually own that car versus, I think BMW backed away from this, and maybe I've even heard this from you, Matt, but BMW was proposing to have subscription base for their heated seats, right? Yeah. So you would have heated seats in your BMW, but only be able to access that feature via subscription, which is like not an idea of owning a car. Like, I mean, you own that car, right?
I think they were also going to do it so that the tune on the motor was based on a subscription fee. So they just reach in and, reflash it to have more or less horsepower.
Yeah, I think that might still stand with some Mercedes models and stuff. I'm not totally sure. But just back to, I know we try to own some old cars around here, and we seem to have better luck with them anyway, as opposed to a lot of the new stuff nowadays. But so I think we can try, in the midst of maybe things going that direction, to keep that spirit alive, like you're saying, Matt, with some of these online forums and people tinkering in those ways. But it does seem like there is increasingly sharp divide between people, whether or not coming from top down, a sharp divide between people who have learned to do anything and any ownership with their vehicles versus those who would take their car to get oil changed somewhere, and they wouldn't know the difference between $50 and $300 for that. Like, they would just have no concept.
It seems like, one thing we can worry about is whether the disposition to want to sort of be master of your own stuff is dying. I sometimes, console myself with the thought that, well, the human spirit is indestructible, and it will always, you can kick it down, but it's always going to come back. But then the sort of technological environment makes me second guess that, simply because, sort of the means of managing the population have gotten so powerful. And not, you don't even need to posit some kind of malicious conspiracy or something like that. It's simply, the entertainments, for one thing, that are available to people are so enthralling and so powerful and omnipresent because it's in your pocket. That can go a long way towards sapping any kind of initiative, and that sort of spirited determination to take things in hand for yourself in the real world. And then, of course, the whole surveillance issue and the prospect of some kind of social credit system. It just seems like the technologies of social control have gotten so powerful that it makes me sometimes second guess that basic faith that the human spirit will always persist.
On that note, this happened to me. My dad, during the Freedom Convoy in Canada last year, my dad donated like $50 or something. It wasn't very much. And as, Trudeau and his right hand granddaughter of Ukrainian Nazis, Chrystia Freeland, were initiating this freeze on bank accounts, my dad saw what I was doing in the media and reporting on that and giving my opinion. And he called me and he's like, Gordy, are they going to like freeze my bank account? Should I go take all my money out of the bank? Like, he was shit scared that his entire financial world was going to collapse simply because he donated $50 to a peaceful protest movement. And like, there's a serious problem when they've gotten into the heads of a sort of like normie boomer like my dad, like, that's like, I mean, that's like a sort of new level of fear and consideration for the average person now, that the state's going to come down on you just merely for expressing your solidarity with people that they've declared to be an enemy.
Yeah.
Like how, and again, we've witnessed lots of craziness with the COVID regime all around the world. This is not unique to Canada or the United States, but like, that part of the human spirit that expresses itself and manifests different ways, be it like tinkerers, people like ourselves that have a sort of sense of meaning from working on things, driving things, the sort of particular driving culture we have here. Like I said before, if they're willing to go that hard, like what does it mean to try and resist that? Like, and are people going to be willing to do it, having seen like what happened in Canada? So you live in the Bay Area, is that correct, sir?
Yeah.
So California would have had its own. I mean, California always has its own variations on lunacy. Have you stayed there throughout the last few years?
So I've moved out here in 2019, just in time for some COVID fun. Yeah, it was pretty bad. And you know what? The masks are coming back. I mean, they never fully went away. There've been people masked up throughout, but the latest little uptick in you get the masked people multiplying again.
Right. So this leads to a question I was discussing with Brandon before the show. So, you've started this project on Substack, Archedelia. You're trying to examine, the revealing of the rules, the party state. But your first sort of instance of fame, as it were, was from shop class as Soulcraft, which, a lot of sort of normie NPR nerd types took to be, that they sort of simplified what you were saying as just extolling the virtues of a literal shop class. Like, yeah, maybe we should keep woodworking and auto mechanics in the schools instead of shunting everybody off into the sort of digital realm. I wonder, do you still kind of get invites from those people? Like what the sort of people who glommed onto your writing at the beginning, are they still around now that Archedelia has been out there?
Yeah, I've kind of outed myself, I'm afraid. Yeah, not so much. Yeah, New York Times hasn't come calling me. But yeah, you're right. The shop class book, it was very kind of politically ambiguous in a good way. And it wasn't that I was just trying to like be cagey or anything, but it was an argument. It was really addressed to everybody, and I was glad to be able to pull that off.
Matt, I just wondered if you could speak to kind of two different visions of humanity that seem to be still alive and hopefully will continue to be alive. But I think you summed it up well in Why We Drive, where maybe over half the book, you almost contrast the type of pilot of that airliner that I think crashed in San Francisco, I'm pretty sure, versus
No, it was
like a Sullenberger.
it was in the Hudson River, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Sullen.
well, that one landed. I'm saying
Oh,
the one that you originally bring up is it like Asiana? How do you say
oh
the
yeah, right. Uh-huh.
And you point out that the NTSB report said that there was, in their own training, if you can call it training, they highly encourage pilots to let the plane do everything.
Yeah.
Like let the plane, do everything. And part of the issue with this jigging of the world, for whatever reason, whether it be safetyism or whatever we say, safetyism doesn't seem to be a good argument when you really get through it, but it sounds great at first, I guess. But the autonomous vehicles, these flight controls for commercial airliners and other planes, they are a system developed, but obviously problems that occur fall outside what the system is designed for and can see. And so in that case, what you need is actually skill and excellence, right? Like Sullenberger, he said that when he was contemplating his landing with no fatalities at all, something that no one thought could happen, a low altitude, both engine failure in a highly populated area. He said that is as though he was banking up little bits of skill and experience for 42 years. And then on that day was able to make a very large withdrawal, and this push for autonomy everywhere and the jigging of the human person to where the skills we don't use atrophy, obviously. I mean, we've lost this sense of the actual need for skill and agency when the wicked problems of the world do arise. I wonder if you could speak more to that concept.
Yeah, well, the automated cockpit is, that's an area where automation has been going on for decades now, and it's one of the most well studied for what's called human factors. And so that's all the problems that arise when human beings have to interact with automation. And so one thing about systems that are extremely complex and automated is that they tend to be brittle. And so just as you pointed out, they try to anticipate every possible scenario, but reality being what it is, there's going to be some scenario that wasn't anticipated. But precisely because they are so multi-layered and complex, when that happens, they tend to fall apart. And another consequence is that the operator, like the pilot in this case, who's suddenly called upon to deal with some situation, he has to get his head in the game real quick. But one of the inevitable consequences of this level of automation is that they tune out. It's just humanly impossible to stay engaged when you're not doing anything. So yeah, I mean, I love that story of Captain Sully landing the plane, and it's like that's like exemplifies this kind of, well, I mean, competence, obviously, and the indispensable role of humanity. And I think people reacted to that story so strongly precisely because it was like a kind of defiant example of someone, presumably having to fight the system to regain control. I think that was due to bird strikes in both motors, right? So it wasn't that the system had failed and gotten confused,
but something from outside the system, something it didn't. It reminds me of like a Nissam Taleb Black Swan or something situation. But with what you're saying, are we losing more than just skills and abilities by having all this automation? Are we actually losing like what it means to be human?
Yeah, I think we're getting coaxed into ever greater passivity and dependence. And that has political consequences. There's something that you can call, I think, the Republican personality, small r, or the Democratic personality, that is sort of predicated on self-reliance and self-mastery as well. Tocqueville thought that it was in the sort of small bore everyday activities that personality is cultivated, where we learn to work things out for ourselves and cooperate. So the more you can try to eliminate the human element from every human activity, and forestall those moments of having to improvise and figure shit out, you're going to have a population that can't do jack, right? You ever see that?
And they'll be stressed for it, right? Because like in your Why We Drive, you talk about, you built this contraption with these mice that can drive these little cars, right?
There's
for
my
food.
wife,
Yeah. So somehow you noted that the mice or rats, whatever you're using, the ones that were passengers were far more stressed than the ones driving the vehicles, right?
Yeah, there's this great research on what's called effort-driven rewards. And a lot of this is with rats, where if you just provide everything to the rats, in their plexiglass cage, they get really depressed and anxious, as opposed to having, to work for their food and sort of live in an environment that puts demands on them.
So it feels kind of inevitable then, if we're moving into a time where more and more aspects of our lives are jigged. It's like no shock that we suffer from very high like depression and other things in our society, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, the world we are coming to inhabit really doesn't invite action. It doesn't sort of lay itself open to your sort of direct control. I mean, less and less. And so that movie WALL-E, there's that great scene where they're hovering around in these car-like pods, drinking from enormous cup holders or slurping their Slurpees, and they're watching their screens, and they're, these sort of shapeless blob people, and their faces beam with this kind of slackened, opiate pleasure. So these are people that are completely safe and secure, and somehow less than human.
Some of the happiest people I've ever met are farmers, loggers. My last job, I was driving a logging truck up around upstate New York and northern Pennsylvania. And, there's something to be said of the old stereotype of the jolly woodsman, someone that knows how to use a chainsaw, drive a skidder, understands something a little bit about the terrain he's operating in, has a reason to get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
And one of the, I just had a roundtable discussion with some fellow skeptics of automation technology. The sort of meaning that's imbued and that we derive from our work is not something to be trifled with. And, some people might call me like a neo-Luddite or techno-reactionary. Maybe they'll call you that. But there's like a point of diminishing returns with technology, I think.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I don't know a ton about the Luddites. I really need to read this book by Kirkpatrick Sale that Brandon recommended to me, Rebels Against the Future, just to make sure that I'm not operating on a stereotype based on my shallow understanding of the term. The measure, like what the available efficiency, the return we get from handing off so many tasks to technology, to screens, to whatever, versus like your happiness, and I think we've approached that, like, and I don't just mean us, like in society in general, is kind of at this inflection point. I really appreciate how you've sort of been a cartographer of that in a way, in your inquisition into the sort of meaning we apply to this, and it's been very illuminating to me. And I highly recommend everybody read your books, because like we're at this point where we have to sort of ask ourselves kind of collectively, like how much more of this of our lives and our meaning and our reason to get out of bed in the morning are we just going to let them like bureaucratize away? You know, I don't think this is, I don't think they're taking it seriously. Like this is not trifling.
Yeah, I agree. And, to take driverless cars as one example of what we're talking about, there's this mantra that human beings are terrible drivers, and that's what justifies all this. It strikes me as a very expensive solution to a non-problem. Human beings are actually really good at driving. So, I mean, you mentioned the Luddites. As I understand it, often if you call someone a Luddite, what are you saying? You're saying they like have some kind of romantic anti-technology stance. It's kind of idealistic and woolly-headed and hankering after the past or something. But the actual Luddites who smashed the, I guess, steam-driven cotton mills, I think it was like Manchester or someplace like that. It was a perfectly rational action. They were being put out of work by this, it was a kind of automation or mechanization. So it wasn't like they were, irrational or nostalgic. They were simply acting on their own interests. So I think we need to rehabilitate the term Luddite as someone with a clear-sighted sort of grasp of the political economy that stands behind automation and has enough spirit to make a claim on his own behalf for his livelihood and way of life.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned that people are actually really good drivers. You know, I met a man a couple of weeks ago who had been given an award by the government for being like a 4 million miles safe hazmat driving, and in the Northeast, no less, where the traffic is pretty bad. And one of my arguments, I don't want to say like necessarily against this technology, but against its imposition based on a decision to not improve humans, right? Like people can be trained to do things much better. They can be rehabilitated if they've developed bad habits. There's ways of making people better. There's ways of improving systems, but there's this tendency to just view all this new, marvels brought to us by the tech bros as the answer to everything, when more often than not, the answers are simpler and cheaper, but they require you to engage with other people and teach them something and like make them better, make them, live up to their potential as like skilled operators in the world.
I'm glad you said that because that points to a basic anti-humanism that seems to stand behind, having technological solutions. So to go back to the example of driving, I mean, driver education in this country is so minimal compared to, say, Germany, where it's like very in-depth, very demanding. And, as one result, you can have autobahns with no speed limit because people are looking in their mirrors constantly because there's going to be some Mercedes coming up at 130 miles an hour behind you if you're, in the wrong lane. So if you have a kind of determination to, as you said, invest in people and education, it's extraordinary what human beings are capable of. You have to have a kind of social order that affirms those human possibilities and affirms the basic worth of the human being. Otherwise, you're going to slide into this kind of techno elimination project of sidelining human beings.
Well, it seems like in what we've been talking about is we've started to, and maybe for quite some time, have adopted tools that diminish the human person, for whatever reasons, safetyism, for whatever other reasons we put on it. What does it look like when we adopt tools that actually enlarge the human capacity instead of squash it and hold that human excellence and capability and capacity as something good to be expanded and to flourish, and not to push away. How do we produce more Sullys?
Yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes I'd be happy enough if we just go back to like 1985 or something, before these anti-humanism seemed to get so kind of militant. And you mentioned Ivan Illich before. He had that book, Tools of Conviviality. He's talking about tools that are sort of directly accessible and that don't require sort of bureaucratic system standing behind them that you're always kind of at the mercy of. So I think of software as the opposite, right? When I'm a writer, so I use Microsoft Word, but it's constantly screwing up on me, and I just feel so utterly helpless. There was one time I actually ended up on like tech support because I just bought the Microsoft Office, and ended up chatting with, on the screen with some dude. His name was Christian, who took control of the computers, and so he's like, the cursor's flying around, he's doing stuff. So I thought, okay, well, here's an actual person. I'm gonna try to engage him a little bit on the weirdness of his job. And I eventually decided this was probably a robot because his responses were so canned, and he wasn't gonna joke about his employer's surveillance software monitoring how quickly he got this done, things like that.
So one of the claims made by technologists, there's a critique of this coming from the sort of economic left, from Marxists, that, with all of these advances in technology, efficiencies of scale, this should have given people more time off, more time for leisure. It hasn't. The economy doesn't exactly work that way. And now, we are in a, like I said before, this technological imperium. And, there are a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands who are not rebuilding the motor in a Volkswagen, or not tinkering, or not, building decks, whatever. And there's an awful lot of what some people call sort of like online social ills. A lot of young men playing video games, a lot of young women playing video games, a lot of online pornography and other sort of stuff where people are glued to screens because they're not really doing anything in the material realm. And the regime, as it were, has rose to defend this stuff. Like, if you criticize OnlyFans, you're a misogynist. If you talk about pedophilia, you get coded as a right winger. And there's sort of these ways where our bifurcated, political cultural system sort of reinforces all of this sort of useless things people do in the absence of having any work. And I guess this sort of brings your two projects together, where, you're trying to honor the meaning of work and criticize this regime we come under. So I guess the question is, what can we do to try and get people back into like material reality and away from this screen time suck thing that seems to be like consuming so much of like human potential?
Yeah, if you have kids, then you know that it's like you're up against this voracious machine that gathers them up at every opportunity. So, for example, during COVID, schools were closed and kids had to have a laptop, and school required it. I mean, even before COVID, a lot of schools required, I think, in fact, our schools did require them to have a laptop because, the courses are done through Google Classroom or something. And then, of course, once they have the laptop and the internet connection, now it's like this Trojan horse, and you're, as a parent, you're battling constantly. It introduces this strife into the family, and you feel like you don't have, like, your authority is kind of, for other sort of cultural reasons, the authority of fathers in particular is, I think, very shaky. because there's been such a long-standing kind of polemic against the father as this authoritarian figure going back. So I don't know. All that's to say that I think it's in family life in particular that this really hits you as a problem that goes beyond the individual, it's collective. And, I mean, there are people who do a far better job than I did in kind of setting bounds on their kids and getting them engaged in doing real stuff. But it's a challenge. Do you have any suggestions? I know you've got kids.
Yeah, I have a 5-year-old daughter and a 3.5-year-old, and I wonder sort of about the future they're inheriting from us. I got started late. I didn't have children until I was 39. Well, that's neither here nor there, but I guess having them late's given me lots of time to think about it. And we're trying real hard not to allow the screens. Like, I don't really have a TV anywhere in the house. We have like a flat screen in me and my wife's bedroom, but we really don't let the kids watch TV very much. I mean, sometimes they complain about it though, because it's sort of inescapable, they go to preschool and, their friends talk about Frozen and, whatever the latest Disney thing is or whatever. I try and encourage my kids to come outside when I'm doing stuff, like come out with mom and dad into the garden. My 5-year-old knows how to ride a bike already. So that's something, and when I was still trucking, I'd bring the truck home and sometimes I would take them for little truck rides. I'd like puff along in third gear, kind of idle, and try and give them an idea of what dad does. There's a lot of people that don't have kids, and not everybody sort of rolls like me. But I guess, my suggestion would be do things with your children as much as possible. Best advice I've got.
Yeah, well, that sounds right.
I just wanted to read this quick bit because it's just impacted me so much this last year when I read it. We talk a lot about we've talked a lot about like 1984 in the midst of COVID and everything else, and we've talked about this book too, although I feel like we haven't given it quite enough time just as a collective culture. But Brave New World, Neil Postman said that it was a little bit older than Orwell's book. Huxley wrote it, but he argued that that Huxley, not Orwell, was right, and that Huxley wrote this book to talk about culture that we didn't need to ban books, but there'd be no one who wanted to read them because there'd be so much information, and Orwell feared that we'd become a captive culture, and Huxley feared that we'd become a trivial culture, right? So, and that we were failing to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. But this, in the book, it's this savage. That's what they call him in this book, because he grew up outside of this system that conditioned everything, right? And he's talking to the controller about all of this because he says that, you just abolish these slings and arrows. It's too easy. You don't suffer nor oppose. You just get rid of these things. And he said, well, we can have all these things without any of the inconveniences. And the savage says, but I like the inconveniences. We don't, said the controller. We prefer to do things comfortably. But I don't want comfort, said the savage. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. In fact, the controller said, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. All right, then, said the savage defiantly. I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence, and the savage at last said, I claim them all. A certain sense of what are we fleeing at times when we seek just comfort, and everything else that we've been offered might be to lose like our whole humanity, what it means to be a person. Being a person is weighty, and it seems to come with the struggles of developing skill and agency and sorrow and joy and all of those things. Yeah, I hope we can again encourage people to see that to lose the negative sides of that equation is to lose actually the whole thing.
I like the word weighty that you used. I think we've lost any sense that suffering can have meaning. And when that's the case, if you lose that sense, then there's this mission to eliminate all suffering. Seems like to do that would be to eliminate the human condition.
To attempt to eliminate all suffering is going to cause a different kind of suffering.
If you have some sense that human life as it is and all of its imperfections and messiness is good, that it's a gift, then that would be the sort of contrary disposition that would orient you to the world in a posture of gratitude rather than the sort of compulsion to remake it according to some utopian vision.
So, sir, you currently teach at the University of Virginia. Do I have that correctly?
No, I've never actually taught except high school for a year, which was a disaster. But so I'm a fellow there.
So what's the difference between like being a fellow and being a professor or teacher? And how did I screw this up?
Yes, I don't teach. So they just when I had lived in Virginia, they gave me an office, which was really nice, and they continue to give me some financial support just to write my stuff and do what I do. It's really a wonderful thing.
You're in the Bay Area now, and you work with maybe a Catholic seminary or something there?
Not officially. I go there a lot. So I actually, no, so I got it correct. I did actually co-teach one seminar at this seminary. It was on the topic of sovereignty with a guy named Adrian Walker, who's a really great thinker. Yeah, so I've been hanging out with the Catholics lately and digging it.
Yeah, my most recent episode of my show was with a fellow on Twitter by the name of Michael Thomas of Sharon. He works with the Catholic land movement, and he's a big fan of this idea called distributism.
Yeah, I haven't listened to that episode yet. It just came in my inbox.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think you'll enjoy it. I don't know a lot about that. This is part of the reason I brought Brandon in. He seems to think there's a lot of Catholic social teaching going through your work or influencing it in some way. I am ignorant of these things, but I'm open to hearing about it. And anyway, my discussion with Mr. Sharon, it touched on a lot of this, because from his position, he sees all these problems in the world. We got all this homelessness, but like, why not just teach people to timber frame and build houses? And he's real big on this idea in distributism that everybody should have property. It should be widely distributed property owned privately, not equally distributed property that's owned by the government. And that we might be a little bit better off, but it seems like we're going in the opposite direction where, they want everybody to be in tight urban centers. And then the subscription service, this whole subscription service thing really drives me kind of crazy. And I mean, they're really open about that. I wanted to, as another question, I want to ask you about this. So like, I've listened to a couple of other people's podcasts interviewing the guys behind autonomous truck technology.
Mm-hmm.
And they call their technological packages drivers, right? So it's the Aurora driver, it's the Wabi driver, what they're calling their technology that they install on, say, a Peterbilt or someone else's truck. But the guy gave it away when he was on this woman's podcast. He was the CEO of Aurora. He said, you'll go to Peterbilt, you'll buy the truck, you'll come to Aurora, we'll put the Aurora driver in the truck, and then you'll pay for a subscription. And I'm assuming that's in perpetuity. It's sort of like, imagine you're me, who's a trucker, and you're going to be replaced not only by a robot, but to like rub salt in the wounds. They're not actually getting rid of my wage. It's just being transferred to Aurora in the form of a subscription, right? Like it's a double whammy.
Yeah.
And the subscription model is kind of everywhere. Mr. Thomas of Sharon sort of likened it to like, we're stuck with like these permanent utility bills. And like another, as what Mr. James C. Scott might call like a system of control, keeping people on the reservation.
Yeah. You will own nothing and be happy.
Man. I'm gonna own my 1998 Toyota Tacoma until I'm dead or it's dead, whichever comes first. And I'm probably gonna bankrupt my meager income in buying parts and trying to keep the thing alive. Because in a way, my pickup makes me happy. I don't know. Do you have a favorite car? Like you fix these motorcycles and cars and stuff, Matt. Like are you? I'm assuming you're planning on doing the same. You're gonna keep your vehicles for as long as possible.
Well, I invested a crazy amount of time in this one car project. It was over 10 years, which is the bug I described in Why We Drive. And it is an absolute screamer, and I love driving it. So
did you get your oiling system figured out? Last time I talked to you, you said you were getting
God.
wear on the cam, I think, right?
Yeah, so what a saga. So yeah, after probably about 1,000 miles on the motor, I did a complete teardown and rebuilt because the cam went flat. And since then, I've continued to have oil pressure problems. And just yesterday, day before, I believe I discovered the root cause. There's this one oil gallery that I plugged, and the proper way to do it is to tap it for a tapered pipe plug. But me being too clever, I've machined a plug that's just like an interference fit and tapped it in there. And it's like, okay, that's good and snug, but no, there's like oil getting past it. That's my saga. It's always something.
How about motorcycle? What's your favorite old school motorcycle? Do you have one? I recently just got a 1985 Honda Nighthawk 700S. I'm very excited
Okay,
about it.
cool. Yeah, well, old Hondas, that was kind of my bread and butter when I had the bike shop, usually 70s stuff, sometimes 60s. I kind of got over the whole vintage bike thing at some point. I just want to go fast. So the bike I actually ride is a Yamaha FJ09, and it's sweet. It's a triple.
So on the subject of motorbikes, I'm supposed to ask you a question from a friend of the show and a friend of mine in real life, a Twitter anonymous account by the name of Big Sib, who's really big on motorbikes and big trucks. Um, have you ever heard of a book called XS11 Heaven by a fellow named Bob Jones?
I don't think so. XS11 Heaven? No,
Right. All right. Well, I'm going to change that.
you already have.
Yeah, you'll have to keep an eye on your mailbox, your snail mailbox.
All right.
We'll leave it. We'll leave the mystery at that.
Well, it's been fun, guys.
Yeah, I appreciate your time, Matthew. I you know big fanboy. I was a little nervous coming into this, and I wrote this little thing I want to end the show with, just to sort of tie the politics and stuff together. I think you give a considered philosophical argument and voice to a type of populist dispossession brought upon by all of this new mandated or otherwise technology. And I think that voice is necessary. And it's been really good for me to make sure I'm not going crazy watching all this stuff happen. And like I said a couple times before on the show, if anyone is not reading your books, especially if they're, driver, mechanic, working class chud, whatever, like at very least they need to read Why We Drive. And
Well, I appreciate that, Gord.
thank
Yeah.
you for writing it. It's a fantastic, fantastic book.
Well,
And
coming from a like legit truck driver, that means a lot.
yeah, one of the things, I've been trying to dabble in writing myself. And as you can tell from my hosting of this discussion here, I kind of ramble on and I don't always arrive at the point I'm trying to make in an efficient manner. Your writing is very it is very efficient. Like there's no wasted verbiage. Like you make the point, you make it well. Your vocabulary is insane, and you get to it, right? It's like a mechanic. You have a mission. You need to fix this part on the vehicle. You need to get this system working, and you need to get this idea across. Your writing does it very like quickly, and it's very enjoyable on the way. And like I say, thanks again, and I really, really enjoy your work.
Well, thanks for the kind word about the writing, and really enjoyed your show. So I'm looking forward to more episodes of the Voice of Gord.
Yeah, I appreciate all your books. I think I think The World Beyond Your Head is like still probably my favorite, even having read all. I mean, they all have their own place, but The World Beyond Your Head is a special place and some good connections there. And I love the bit about the organ shop and stuff. So it's been great to kind of get to know you through your writing. It's great to actually talk to you now. It's been a long time since I started reading you, so it's great fun.
Thanks, Brandon.
Right. So if anyone wants to find Matthew online, it's matthewbcrawford.com. And
Yeah, I haven't even messed with that website in years. But if you Google Matthew B Crawford Substack, you'll find my Substack, and that's where I'm currently, writing at.
yeah, and I mean I butt up against and am adjacent to some sort of dissident political thinkers, or at least I read their stuff, and I think your work complements theirs and makes it a little more real because you like bring it down to the sort of the finer grain of how this stuff functions, and make it relatable and accessible to a sort of working class dumbass like myself. So yeah, I highly recommend Archedelia. All right, or is that it? Is that all we got, guys?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, well, way of the road.
Okay, cheers, and keep the rubber side down.